Hey everyone, it's Matt Barden here. I'm coming to you, like most times, from my home recording slash production studio. Basically, what I want to talk to you about today is just discussing, what kind of computer you might need in order to create. I'm going to specifically reference orchestral music, but this could be for just about any kind of music that you want to make. What kind of computer do I need for audio production? So I've got a few things I want to talk about, but I'll point out right now that this is not a sponsored video, but I do utilize a lot of services from Sweetwater for getting new gear, and they just so happen to contain a lot of the information I had already compiled in one page. So I'm going to use that. That's what's on the screen right now as a kind of guideline to point out a few things because I agreed with everything I had found was already, agreed with by them and put onto this page. So again, it's not sponsored, but I'll put a link to here down below. And if you're in the market for buying some gear, I definitely recommend checking them out. Basically nothing but good things to say, but this isn't a sponsored video, so I'm not going to say those. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff we can go in through here, and I'm not going to read the whole page because otherwise why would I make this video? But there's a lot of stuff to consider, particularly, the RAM and hard drives. There's also the processor, I should say, the processor, RAM, and hard drives. Those are kind of the three big things that you kind of need to at least make sure are at a certain level in order to pull off creating this music. Everything else can more or less be up to user preference. Maybe you want a bigger screen versus a smaller one, certain keyboards and other ports and things. That kind of varies. But so this is just kind of breaking down what all this kind of stuff is and the terminology. I'm going to assume you know what a hard drive is and how RAM works. I'm not going to go through and explain that. But what I've got right here are kind of the minimum requirements in order to run a DAW, I should say, on a Windows PC. Now, I'm just going to put the Windows 11 stuff up here. I think, at least at the time I'm recording this at 3:41 p.m. on September 20th, 2022, most people still have a Windows 10 PC, generally speaking. So I'll put this on the screen, but we'll just kind of scroll down into the Windows 10 section. So I'm personally running Windows 10, and this is what we have here, kind of the bare minimum requirements. So if you need to, have Windows 10, this is kind of the bare minimum stuff, mostly just to have Windows 10. If you can run Windows 10, you can more or less run some of these other things. So basically, the bare minimum is 2 gigabytes of RAM, 32 gigabytes of storage space, a 1 gigahertz or faster multi-core CPU, and some graphics drivers and a screen. Again, that's more so for just getting Windows 10 onto your device. But you could do some stuff with this. What I wanted to point out, though, is that you will be very hard pressed to find a computer that doesn't meet these requirements. These are nowadays very difficult to find something with less than 2 gigabytes of RAM, and less than a 1 gigahertz. That's kind of hard to do. Without getting really, really old parts. So if you have an older computer, you may need to consider upgrading for there. But that's just, again, the bare minimum requirements. This stuff right here is what's recommended for your digital audio workstation, the software that creates music. I personally use Studio One for most of my things, but I also have Live. What else do I have? A bunch of stuff on here, and even more on my laptop that goes around with me, just for different things. But generally speaking, these will kind of fit. These requirements will fit most things, most softwares. But check with your DAW of choices documentation just to make sure that you have that. So if you know you're going to be using Reaper, go find the Google Reaper system requirements and see what they say. It may be a little bit different. You might be able to get away with a lower specs, but what we've got right here are these are kind of the recommended bits. And again, even this is um, not terribly hard to come across. It's a little bit much in some cases. So the 64-bit, Intel i5 or AMD Ryzen 5, that's pretty common. I think you can find that in most computers nowadays or better. I'll show you my specs in a little bit, and I went as high as I could afford on those, but you don't have to do that. But I think even the super cheap laptops that my students work with in the high school have an Intel i5 processor, so that should be fine. For most things you can find. The things that may drive your cost up would be the RAM. 16 gigabytes is a lot, but if you are working primarily in a DAW, then that is very resource intensive for all of that audio editing and processing and getting all the stuff compiled ready to export to the world. So 16 gigabytes isn't nuts. I would recommend. I would say you could probably get by with 8 if you weren't doing a whole lot of other stuff at the same time on the computer. 16 is a general safe spot to be for doing a lot of editing. But if it's more of a thing and you're not using Avid, you could probably get away with 8 gigabytes without too much sacrifice. Basically, the more RAM you have, the faster your computer can do all of its stuff. As for the space, I can't even talk anymore. Hard drive space. This works. I personally like to have as much space as I can. I think between all of my hard drives, both installed on my motherboard and connected to my computer, I'm at somewhere around like 20 terabytes of stuff for just storage and backup. So I tend to be in the camp of more is better in terms of digital storage space. For most laptops, I think you can get a about 250 gigabytes size without too much trouble. I know they definitely come a lot smaller, so check that out. Basically, sound files can take up a lot of space. Libraries of virtual instruments and effects take up even more space. So you may not need a terabyte, but now that they're a lot more cost effective, I would recommend getting a 1 to 2 terabyte drive just for storing all your stuff, the virtual instruments and things like that. They just take up so much space, and then you can have a dedicated spot to save all of your files, and just have that on a nice little hard drive and keep all the core stuff on the desktop, which again can take up a good bit of space. The way I personally do it with the students I teach is their computers have the i5. I think it's 8 gigabytes of RAM. I don't think it's 4. I think it's 8. I'd have to look at the computers, but they only have about 80 something gigabytes. They have external drives that store all the stuff, but you can get by with less. Just know that the less you have in the internal storage, the more you might need in external storage. From there, it's kind of up in the end for what you need. Again, I'll put a link here, but there's a nice little handy set of links on this page for different DAWs if you're going to work in a DAW. I'm assuming you're wanting to, record these orchestral tracks and produce them and all that, and send them out to various things. If you're more like me in terms of my background, I started with traditional music composition and music notation and stuff like that. So I would use software like I currently use Dorico, but I've also used Finale and Sibelius, things that create sheet music, but can also play some stuff back. And generally, if you're getting a computer that can run the DAWs, you'll have no problem running a notation software. But if you're only doing a notation software, you could probably get by with a little bit less on all of those requirements. But honestly, with modern computers, I'd recommend just making sure it can run a DAW, and then you'll pretty much be fine until you have to do video editing. Um, but again, just like with all of these DAWs up here, you can just Google, your notation software system requirements, and those are made readily available by the company. So here's the one for Dorico, and I personally have Dorico Pro, so I can see what I need for Mac or Windows. The bare minimum stuff, which is super simple. Um, yeah, i5. So if your computer is newer than 2013, you're probably okay. I have all my computer meets all of this in spades, but again, this is what they recommend, and usually with the less intensive hardwares, you can get by with or softwares, you can get by with less stuff. So I'm just gonna scroll through this just so you can see it. If you need to focus on one thing, um, you can pause the video at that point. All right. Since I mentioned it, and you might be curious, here are the stats for my personal computer. I was thinking about all this while I was trying to put it together, but I personally do a bit more, programming and rendering of graphics and processing, and a whole lot more of that. So I personally, when I built this PC, got the highest end uh, components I could afford, and still have all of my stuff. So I've got, this AMD Ryzen 9, 12 core processor at 3.7 gigahertz. That's a really fancy processor. They have newer, nicer ones now, I'm sure. It's about a year old, but that's way overkill for what you really need. Don't think you have to be like me and get the most you can. Like, you don't need 64 gigabytes of RAM. I rarely go above 12% of my RAM usage, just in average, just setting up the computer when all the stuff runs. That's all the things. But definitely look into that 64-bit operating system. Most things, big programs nowadays need that. But yeah, there's my specs if you were ever curious about what I'm running. I also have an old MacBook Pro from 2017, and it doesn't give me any issues with any of this stuff. So anyway, that's that. I mean, just in terms of how great of a computer you need, you really don't need a great computer, but you don't want a horrible one. Like, don't get the cheapest one you can find. Um, you want to get something that's just a little bit more powerful than that, and generally speaking, you should be okay. I would not recommend doing any of this on a tablet. You might be able to get away with like GarageBand on an iPad. The iPad Pro certainly meets all of the bare minimum uh, stuff that we've mentioned. Um, but I wouldn't recommend it personally. Mostly it's just because of the interfaces. A lot of these programs are designed to work with a computer and a mouse, but even then, with the more powerful tablets, you'd be spending tons more money just on the tablet form over the processing power. And my experience just hasn't been that great. I'd rather spend that money on a better processor and just work at a normal desktop. If you are really wanting that, though, the Microsoft Surface lines, those are basically just a PC with a touchscreen at that point. Just double check what your settings are, but those are still a little limited, especially in storage space, and sometimes RAM, but mostly the hard drive storage space. Um, that can be a little bit limited on the devices. The last thing I want to mention here is this section up here, which is just if you're going to be focusing more on recording. Um, if that they just kind of have some spots right here. Basically, you just need mostly space. You can get by with more or less whatever for whatever. But you'll need a lot of hard drive space to take up those recordings. If you're doing a lot of mixing and mastering, you'll need more on the processing side. So you could possibly spend more on the processor, less on the other stuff. Just again, figure out what you need to do and build your device around that. Um, as for the composing, I don't necessarily agree with this, but it depends on what you want to do. Again, the most of the music I write is either done by the computers or I'm making sheet music to give to performers to play stuff. So I mean, I don't need an AMD Ryzen 9 or an Intel i9 for my processor. I don't think that's necessary. But if you're going to be doing a lot of, again, DAW work, live performances, composing with that kind of stuff, you may need that. I'm not going to just flat out say they're wrong. I just don't think you need the fastest possible processor to do some basic composing. Uh, RAM, I always think more is better. And if you are doing a lot of processing, you may need bigger for all the bits and pieces. Again, if you're buying a Mac, then that's a little less customizability there. But generally speaking, most Macs can run DAWs without issues. You can pull that up on your own if you are going to use a Mac. But yeah, that's pretty much all the bits and pieces I can think of. Some little recommendations for my students. I've had a few of them ask me, well, what should I get to, is my computer good enough to do this? And blah, blah, blah. Uh, Generally, my answer is it probably is. But hopefully this was helpful for you. I hope you learned something. This could put a little bit of, guidance towards getting your computer creating art. It's always a big plus. So I'm going to start wrapping it out now. You'll probably see screen stuff popping up for other videos to check out. But that's going to be it from me. If you learned something, you enjoyed the content, definitely consider, a like and a subscribe. If you have any questions or thoughts about what I've talked about, put those down in the comments. I also love seeing if what people make. So if you use this to help you decide on what computer components to get and you've made some content, drop a link down below. I love seeing all that stuff that the community makes. And uh, I think that's it. Just assume I said all the normal YouTube stuff people normally say, and I will see you all the next time that I see you. Bye.